Welcome to another broadcast via Facebook Live of Zion's Banner. We're completing our little series on Advent through Jewish eyes. We're going to be dealing with Micah 5:2, Messiah's pre-existence and his deity, in terms of Advent. And Advent actually is a very Jewish holiday, so we're going to be looking at some prophecy, some objections to that prophecy, some application, and even the background of Micah 5:2. As always, in case your computer is not working that well this evening, and along with the hot chocolate and Advent cookies or latkes, this will be posted on www.zionsbanner.org, and we welcome you to tune in there and watch that. Please feel free to go ahead also to YouTube, look up Zion's Banner, and you can go ahead and subscribe to that channel. So we're looking to have people involved and interacting with us as we interact with you. It is always fun to be able to broadcast live. You want to turn to Micah 5:2 if you just happen to have a Bible around. If you don't and you have your cell phone, you can go ahead and use that. If you don't have access at all, that's okay, because we'll be looking at the scriptures and reading them. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth for me one who is to be the ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from everlasting. Different versions read slightly different, but that's the prophecy that we're looking at. Now what we want to do is we want to get into the background of this. So if you turn there, you need to understand what's going on at the time. Often when we look at prophecy, we look at its connections now, or what we understand it being fulfilled at, but we need to understand why it was given, where it fits into the big story, and we need to understand where Micah fits in as far as when he lived and what was going on. This book is written after the book of Hosea. Micah is a southern He relates to the southern kingdom. We're going to see what's going on in the background there. As far as the time period, we put him near the time of Isaiah. I'm not saying they're exactly together here. We put him after the book of Hosea. There we go. Now let's fit it in the big story. What's going on? We need to ask why this prophecy was originally given. A lot of times, again, we don't put things back in their perspective. We don't look at why a given prophecy was given. In fact, we think everything was given to us, just for us. We need to realize that originally this was given to a specific audience for a specific reason. I'm just turning to that Micah 5:2 so that I can also go ahead and look on with you where you should be looking. The big picture is God's people are in distress. The northern kingdom is being overrun. The Neo-Assyrian Empire is building force. It's a world power. And so that's what's going on. And Judah is being threatened. And with Judah being threatened, the Davidic dynasty is being threatened. So this is a threat that has prophetic significance. It's not just a threat to God's people. That it is too. But it will affect the Davidic kingdom and promises to the Davidic kingdom. And we're looking at these again. And a lot of times the Messianic prophecies, well, for very logical reasons. Messiah is the greater son of David. So often these prophecies fall when the Davidic kingdom is threatened. We need also to see that this connects to the larger section of Scripture. Now, if you look at verse 11, you will see a particular Hebrew word, which, by the way, is omitted in the NIV, which is unfortunate. It's the word now, and it links this oracle to the preceding verses in 9 through 11. So we need to understand that too. There is a direct connection. The end of Micah 4:10 reads, "And to Babylon you shall go, there you shall be delivered, and the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies." And so there's a threat here, and there's the knowledge that the Babylonian captivity is going to occur. Now that's a warning of judgment, but with that there's also promised deliverance. From there you will be redeemed. And so that's the greater context there. The southern kingdoms being overrun. This particular oracle, this particular section of Scripture, ties to the promise and the warning: you will end up being taken to Babylon, but you will be redeemed. So we need to place this back into its context of redemption, the preservation of the Davidic kingdom, and not simply as an Advent story for us. So we need to put this in the bigger picture here. And that's going to help us understand how it does relate to us, as opposed to simply turn to the area, the way it was fulfilled, make that application without putting it into the bigger story. And we want to go ahead and do that. This section of Scripture is about the eventual deliverance of Israel and the eventual promises to the Davidic kingdom being fulfilled. And so when we're looking at this promise, we see a promise in contrast to Jerusalem, which will eventually be overrun. The scene changes at the beginning of 5 in 2, and from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. So Jerusalem is endangered by the Neo-Syrian Empire, which eventually doesn't get Jerusalem, but Babylon does. And Jerusalem is endangered now and will be endangered in the future. Eventually the Babylonian exile will occur. But deliverance will come not from Jerusalem, but ultimately from Bethlehem, a very small city in Judah. So there's a change there. Now let's talk about this pre-existence, because Bethlehem talks about a birth, but this is not just about a birth. This is about a human birth of a pre-existing one. So when we're looking at this section here, most versions say from of old, from everlasting. Some say from of old, of ancient times. But we need to understand what Hebrew word is used there. Mimei, mikidim, mimei olam is the phrase in Hebrew. And so we're dealing with the word olam. And it's translated eternity, pointing to Messiah's pre-existence. However, we also have to be honest with the text. We serve a God of truth. And when we look at Hebrew words, there's a range of meaning to Hebrew words. We have to be honest with the text, look at what the word could mean, as well as what we're pretty sure it does mean, and then know why we believe it means what it means in that context. Olam can refer to in perpetuity or a long period of time. If you were to look at the word book, theological word book of the Old Testament, a very good resource, it translates the word olam as forever, ever, everlasting, evermore, perpetually, old, ancient, or world. Olam can actually mean world in Hebrew. In the Hebrew prayer book, you will see Melech Olam. Well, that's actually king of the universe. It's not king of eternity, so olam can refer to that. It can refer to a non-specific or really long or infinitely long period of time or period of space in Hebrew. And that's why it can have the meaning of universe. So can the objection apologetically be given that olam here simply means in perpetuity, which sometimes happens as far as an objection to this prophecy? Well, it could have that meaning, so now we need to ask ourselves, yes, we're talking about the pre-existence of Messiah, and we believe that this passage talks about how do we know the word olam here does not mean simply of old or ancient? How do we know it means eternity? So let me lay out ways that we can know what this word means in the context, even though there's a range of meaning in the Hebrew. Dr. Brown spends some time with this, and I remember spending some time in his particular series of books, Jewish Objections. The previous uses in Micah is one way. A verse means what it means in context, but how does the author use it throughout his book? See, we can look at that. If we look at Shakespeare, certain words are used certain ways, probably consistent with the usage of the time, but Shakespeare takes some creative opportunities to invent some usages. And the way we could tell the way Shakespeare's using it is not only the way the vernacular uses it at the time, but also the way Shakespeare uses it. So if I'm reading Romeo and Juliet, and I look through yonder window pane, I might examine where that phrase is used in Shakespeare. So previous uses. And you want to look around that context, because it could be used a little different at the end of Micah. So how is it used previous to this passage in Micah? Also, we're talking about parallelism. A lot of the prophetic books are written in Hebrew poetry, so you have a parallelism, and you can tell by the rest of the verse the way it's being used by looking at the parallelism in that verse. And finally, what was the understanding that the people had at the time? When I was growing up, the term, when my dad was around, he loved musicals, and there was this great song that he used to sing about "Let's Be Gay Boys" from one of his favorite musicals, and he understood that slightly differently than you might understand that today, and slightly different than he would have understood it in his day, and so he probably horrified at what some people would get from that song. And so what was the understanding of the people at the time? Let's examine this just a little bit. In Micah 2:9, chapter 4, verse 5, notice we're getting close to this chapter 5 section, and 7, olam clearly means forever. And it's commonly rendered in both Jewish and Christian editions of the Bible as forever in those previous verses to chapter 5. Now remember, I said it might be used differently at the end than it is at the beginning. There are nuances there, and the prophet might be nuancing things. But interestingly enough, as we start to approach this passage in chapter 5, and I know the chapters divisions aren't there, but the flow of the text is, olam clearly means forever in 2:9, 4:5, and 4:7. And by the way, Jewish and Christian versions both translated as forever in those sections as we come up on chapter 5. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. I like to quote really smart guys, Dr. Michael Brown, in Answering Jewish Objections. In his volume on Messianic Prophecy on page 39 is very clear to point this out. So I'm not making stuff up. I'm also a learner, even as I am a teacher, and why not learn from the best? And so we can see the proceeding. Michael Brown is honest, and he says that in chapter 7, after chapter 5, it is rendered in one place in a way that doesn't have to mean forever. But notice that that usage, where it does not mean eternity, only occurs after chapter 5 in Micah, not previous to chapter 5. That's kind of interesting. Micah only nuances the word differently after the prophecy in 5:2. Here's the other thing. There are two words in the passage. Now we're dealing with parallelism. Whose goings forth are of old, okay, from Kedem, and then olam. Let me show you how this works. Okay, whose goings forth are from of old, okay, and you see that word old from Kedem. It can have the idea of ancient. It also has the idea of east. But it has the idea of ancient, and you'll notice most translations translate that of old. Some may have from ancient times. Again, there's some variation in the English translations. But then you see from everlasting. Now, if the word for of old, kedem, meant the same as olam simply meant a long period of time, why are there two different Hebrew words used in parallelism there? That's called redundancy. You know, my professors who are grading my dissertation right now slap me for things like redundancy. And so I don't expect Micah to be a worse writer than I'm expected to be in my dissertation as a prophet of God. I'm sure God could get the message across. And so it would be mere redundancy to have those two different words mean exactly the same thing. Somehow, the from everlasting in the New King James, or from eternity, has to mean something more than kedem means in of old. So that gives us a clue that this means eternity. That it means more than of old. It means more than ancient times. It means more than everlasting in one direction, but it actually has a concept of eternity to it. What was the understanding of the people? Now this gets really interesting, because during the period of time when Jesus walked the earth, there were rabbinical understandings and traditions around that time that viewed Messiah as pre-existing. Dr. Michael Brown does a great job in his book in page 216 of pointing out that there are a couple descriptions and traditions that speak of Messiah's pre-existence or the pre-existence of his name. In fact, he cites one writing, Pesquita Rabbate 152, which says, from the beginning of the creation of the world, Messiah was born, for it entered into the mind of God even before the world was created. This is a rabbinical writing that goes back quite a long ways, and it has Messiah as pre-existing. Now what it doesn't have is Messiah as deity. Now we're going to talk about why you really can't separate pre-existence from eternity, but the rabbis will in their writings actually acknowledge the pre-existence of Messiah and then go to great lengths to deny his deity. And so that gets really kind of creatively interesting, but let's deal with that, okay? Why would I get the idea that Micah 5:2, which for all purposes, the preponderance of the evidence, the Hebrew parallelism, the usages prior to chapter 5, and even the understanding of the people around that time period means eternity. Why would I get the idea that you wouldn't have an eternal being who wasn't deity? Well, let me draw out the argument for you. We call this a syllogism. If it is true that God is eternal, and this is an essential quality of his nature, we talk in philosophy and even in apologetics about essential qualities and non-essential qualities. I could dye my hair black and I would still be Jeff. Okay? But if you rearrange my DNA, I would no longer be Jeff, as Jeff exists. My DNA pattern is an essential part. My maleness is an essential. I would be Jeff Cena if I wasn't male. Okay? That's an essential attribute. Okay? That's what we call an essential attribute. If God is eternal, and that is essential to him being God, he would not be God if he was not eternal. And Messiah is eternal, then it logically follows that Messiah is God. You see how that works? So the Messiahs the rabbis will even acknowledge his pre-existence, but they want to stay away from his deity. But look at this argument here. If I can demonstrate the first premise, that God is eternal, and it is necessary for him to be so to be God, and you acknowledge the pre-existence of Messiah, and you acknowledge Olam is eternal, or eternity. He stepped out of eternity, not just everlasting, not just a really long time ago, not just beyond the 1950s. If you acknowledge that, then it logically follows that he is God. So that's the way that syllogism, that argument, ends up working. So let's talk about this. Can I demonstrate that God's eternal? Well, here's the cool thing. If you go to Psalm 90, verse 2, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. By the way, the word everlasting is olam there. It's ume olam ad olam atah in the Hebrew. So that word olam is clearly being used in terms of eternity, from everlasting past to everlasting future, eternally. That's like a Hebrew idiom for eternally. You are God. Okay? It seems that God is eternal. It seems that the Hebrew Scriptures and the Psalm writer, inspired by the Spirit of God in the Hebrew Scriptures, understands that God is eternal and it's part of being God. Now, let me give you a logical argument, okay? God is not opposed to logic. He is the author of logic. If any being was eternal other than God, then God would not be God. Because then you would have an uncreated being who was not God, who existed. Now you have two gods. Because an uncreated being who has always existed would be displaying a property of deity. So both beings would be displaying a property of deity at the same time. And they would be two different beings. And so you would not have one God, persons. We're not talking about persons. You have two separate, completely different beings with their own essences, both being eternal. Okay? See, God is the uncaused being. If you have another uncaused being who is not also sharing the same essence as God, you then have two gods. So we say God is eternal. Now, the Trinity gets complicated. We're not going to tackle that this evening. We're just going to tackle the pre-existence and deity of Messiah. Is Messiah eternal? We've covered that in Micah 5:2, but I want to let you know that there are other places where Messiah is considered eternal. Isaiah 9:6, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders, and his name will be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Father of eternities, or Everlasting Father. Okay? So it's not just Micah that has this idea, but Isaiah has the same idea. Now, we know God's eternal, and he must be so to be God, both logically and scripturally. We know that Messiah is eternal, so where does this take us? Well, the logical conclusion is that Messiah is God. And then Micah 5:2 is telling us the child to be born in Bethlehem, who stepped out of eternity, is indeed deity, by virtue of him being eternal and sharing a divine attribute. So let's talk about what this means for us during this great Advent season. We are not talking about a mere child. What we're talking about here is that God ends up promising deliverance through Messiah, who is the child to be born, to the Davidic dynasty and to Israel through this prophecy, and then also to us. Okay? We can be assured deliverance because God has sent his eternal Son to go ahead and deliver us. And so, just as Israel was supposed to be delivered, and let's not take this away from its context here, okay? Because we are promised deliverance through the one born in Bethlehem, so too Israel is promised deliverance through the one born through Bethlehem. And you cannot separate that. The original audience was promised its deliverance in desperate times through the one born in Bethlehem, and so too we live in desperate times. And so too Jesus lived in desperate times. If you don't believe we live in desperate times, start paying attention to the situation around the world. News stories come up constantly that indicate we live in desperate times. Future deliverance was promised Israel. Remember that when Micah writes this, it's still hundreds of years away from its fulfillment. So Israel is promised future deliverance in desperate times. Desperate times in Micah's day. Desperate times when the one came forward who would give that deliverance under Rome. Desperate times for us, future deliverance for us through the same child born in Bethlehem, who is indeed not merely a child, but who is deity incarnate. The incarnation is a terribly Jewish idea, and it's a prophetic idea that is uttered by the prophets over and over again. Never let your Jewish friend tell you the incarnation is a Christian idea. Christianity did not get this idea by itself. It received it through the Jewish prophets, and dare I even say, from the Judaism that existed prior to the birth of the church. What an incredible thing. We are promised deliverance, future. They were promised deliverance, future, through the same babe who is also God, who is predicted by Micah so many years ago. And so we see again Advent through very Jewish eyes. Well, Some prophecies take a little longer, some take a little shorter. But again, this will be posted. We hope to be posting the PowerPoints and eventually create materials out of these. Please visit us at zionsbanner.org and feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for being with us this evening.